Greetings and welcome. My name is Aaron Craig with Let's Learn This Together, and this is part 5 of creating a beautiful inventory inside of GameMaker 2.3. In this video, we're going to learn how to do this right here, this animation with sequences, and know how to reverse it to get rid of it. Sequences is a brand new asset type inside of GameMaker 2.3, so if you're not familiar with it, I'm actually going to be covering how to use it from scratch as if you've never used it before. If you already know how, then you can download the finished project inside of the description. There's a link there, and you can just copy the code that I used into your own project. But we're going to be creating this in sequences, and I'm going to be covering animation curves, external curves, and embedded, and everything that goes along with that. Stay tuned to the end for details on the giveaway from my beginner's game course. So let's go ahead and come into our project, and we are going to make a sequence. So I'm going to right-click and create sequence. I'm just going to name this SQ description animation. And then in a sequence, you can actually put in anything you want. You can do sprites, sounds, objects, then you can replace all of those with in-game assets as it's running. There's really very little limit to what you can do with sequences, but we're going to try and keep it fairly simple here. So I'm just going to drag the sprite description onto the sequence, and immediately you can see that it shows up right there. If it didn't show up, then that's probably because for some reason, when you brought it in, your tracker down here was at a different place than at the beginning. So this right here is our sprite in our sequence, and you can only see it while it is available, while this line is in the right spot. So you can drag it all the way up, and I'm going to put it at 40 frames, and then I'm going to bring this sequence length down to 40 frames. So now, if I press play, it plays for 40 frames, which is what we're going to want. Now, there are several things in here that are good to know. The first one is the actual size of our sequence, which in reality doesn't really matter. Now, our room that we've got in our game right now is 704 by 576, and our camera is 640 by 480. So we don't actually need to change the sequence or the canvas size over here, but I found it to be fairly helpful just so that we can kind of eyeball where it's supposed to be. If we change this right here, now I know I'm eventually going to want this to be closer to right around this side of my screen, because that's where I want it to appear. If our canvas was a lot larger, it'd be a little more playing, like animating it over and over again in the room to make sure it's in the right spot. But if we do this, I know it's going to be pretty close to where I want it. So that's what we're going to do. Now, down here on the timeline, everything is controlled by keyframes. And if you've done any video editing or used any of Adobe's software, then you're probably familiar with keyframes and the power of them. Essentially, it will record a property at a specific frame and then translate between property A and property B when moving between those frames. So in the beginning, if I set this right here in the middle and I go up 20 frames or however many I want, and then I move it again, now there's another keyframe right here. And when I go between these, it's going to move between them just like that. So however much that distance is, it will travel 1/20th of that distance every single frame until it gets to where it's going. And you can add as many keyframes in here as you want, and you can kind of actually see them visually in there, which is also really, really cool. So I'm going to Control Z, take those away, because all I want to do is actually move it from the middle here, and at frame 40, I want it to be all the way over here. Now, we're going to do more than just do this, because that's kind of boring, but essentially that's what it's actually going to be doing. Now, we also want to change the scale, or how large or how small it is. So I'm going to come down here and actually add a parameter track. So you can control rotation, color multiply, image index, image speed, origin, and scale. We want scale. Now, if yours is not recording changes, that's because you have automatically record changes off. So you can take that off and then manually add and delete keys. I find it a lot easier to just automatically record them, so that's what I am going to do. So let's go back to frame 0, and on the scale, I'm going to actually come down here, and I'm going to shrink this down to 0. So you can either shrink it manually, which you can do, or you can come in and control these properties and set them It's 0 to 0. So now it's right there, and it exists, it's just so small you can't actually see it. But that's okay, because we know where it is, and what I want to do is when we get to frame 40, I want it to actually be full-sized. So I'm going to change it back up to 100 by 100. Now, it looks like that. But that's kind of boring. It gets the job done, but the really cool thing is that you can start doing some really cool animations once you figure out how to use animation curves. I'm going to click on the scale, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to right-click and convert to an embedded animation curve. So now, if I double-click on it, you can see that this animation curve, well, it's got properties here of X and Y, which aren't exactly correct. It's actually going to be the scale. So I can rename this to width and height, and that's actually what it should be. And even though you can only see a red one, there's also a blue one here. So that's going to be our width and our height. So now we can change these and add more as we so desire. And this is where the power of it comes in. So this is going to allow us to do really fancy and cool animations just by clicking and not having to do code. So I'm going to add some animations to kind of match this to what I had before. I'm probably not going to be able to get it exactly, but that's okay. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to click right there, and now we've got this. And I actually want to change these to be a little bit smoother, so I'm going to click on the curves up here, the curve type, and change it to smooth. And now all of a sudden, we can see that it kind of smooths out, which is what it's supposed to do, and it allows us to play with it, I think, in a little more natural way. So I'm going to give this a bounce. So what I actually want to do is I'm going to scroll up, and this max value right here is 100, or it's what it is naturally. So if you wanted to actually make it larger in the end, you can just bring this up more, but I'm going to leave that there. Instead, I'm going to add another point right here, and I'm going to bring this up a little bit so that when it gets here, it's actually going to be slightly larger than what it was before. And I'm going to click on a point here so that it kind of does it nice and slow, and then we can zoom out and see the whole animation curve. So now if we come down here and I press play, you can see that it kind of does that, and it looks a lot cooler. So we can play around with these and move them as much or as little as one wants. And this is where you can really start getting the power and specific flavors of animation depending on what you want to do and how flashy you want it to be. So this is going to be fairly simple. I'm just going to keep that right there. I think that's totally fine. So now I'm going to exit out of that. So now I'm going to come down here and click on position and right click, and I'm going to actually set this to an external animation curve just to show you this. So I'm just going to create a new one, and it makes it, where does it actually add that? Right down here. I'm going to put this inside of my sequences and just name this AM position. It doesn't really matter. But the power here is that you can create one animation curve just like what we did for this, and you can turn this into a file that then you can assign to really anything else you want. So you don't have to recreate the animation curve every time. You can just set it as its own file. And then if you really like one animation for a projectile or a death animation or something like that, you can just apply that animation to all of them, which becomes really powerful. Now, as an external file, we can actually open it up over here, and it looks exactly the same. There's really nothing different about it. The curve type here starts as smooth, but that's really about it. And then we can add more of them. But I don't actually want to use an external curve right here, so I'm actually going to head and delete this. So then I'm going to click on position. Are you ready to start making the game of your dreams? Then head on over to letslearnthistogether.com to check out my trilogy of courses to take you from beginner to expert. Game development is hard and frustrating when you're going at it alone and you don't have anyone to turn to. Join me on the journey, and I'll be with you every step of the way to alleviate all of that frustration. And by the end, you'll be ready to make any game you can set your mind to. Go ahead and get started now at letslearnthistogether.com. Click on position, right click, and convert to embedded animation curve, and now you can see exactly how it looks. Now I kind of want this to get here a little bit faster, so I'm going to take my X position and move that up so it gets there kind of immediately. That way, when we play it, now it's already moved all the way over, and so when the Y is changing, it looks like it looks a lot better in my opinion. So that's kind of what we're going for right there. So we've got a 40 frame animation inside of our sequence that I think looks stellar. Now we need to actually put this into our game. So let's open up our OBJ controller and check out our draw event. So when we actually click on something, we want this sequence to appear. So we have to first figure out how we can click on something. And the way we're going to do that is by using the function pointInRectangle. So check if mouse is hovering over an item. I'm going to add some enters here. All right, if pointInRectangle, mouse X, mouse Y, and where we're going to check is inside of our for loop here, and we want to check our specific item. And fortunately, we already have variables for exactly where that item X and item Y is, and we're drawing it at 2x scale, which we already set here, and we know that it starts at 16 by 16, so that means now it's now 32 by 32. So if we want to get all around it, we need to go out by 16 on each side. So for the first X, I'm just going to say item X minus 16, then item Y minus 16, item X plus 16, item Y plus 16. Now, if we are hovering over something, let's go ahead and show that. So I'm going to set our alpha to 0.25. I'm going to set our color to sea blue, and I'm going to draw a rectangle over whatever we're hovering. And we're going to draw it at exactly this place too, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that. Then we need to add in a false, because it's not just an outline, and reset the alpha to 1. All right, let's try this. If this works, which it should, we can now see exactly what we're hovering over, and now that means we also know when we are clicking on something because we're inside of there. So inside of this whole if statement right here, let's go ahead and clicked on an item. So let's say if mouse check button pressed. So we click MB left and showing description is equal to false. Now we don't actually have this variable yet, so I'm going to copy it, come over here, and we're going to add this in, and it's going to be equal to false starting out. So this will just tell us when we are actually showing something, the description or not. And, oh, there we go. Don't add a colon at the end of an if statement. So if we click on it, then we want to start showing it. And we made a sequence already, so now all we have to do is just play that sequence. And when we play it, we use the function layer sequence create. And this actually returns whichever sequence that we played. It returns that ID. So we're going to need to store that ID to then check to see like where it's at, how it's playing, and we can also see if it's done playing. Because when it's done playing, that means we actually want to start drawing the item info on that description sheet. So we will say sequence equals, and we need to actually have this be a variable, not just a local one, an instance variable. So I'm going to go ahead and say sequence equals undefined. So it doesn't equal anything to start, and then as soon as we actually do create our layer, it will fill it up, and then we can check to see if it's done playing at that point. So we need to create this on a layer. So in our room, we have instances and we have menu items. What I'm going to do is actually create it on instances because our menu items is going to be drawing stuff over top, so it needs to be on the layer above it. So create it on instances, and we're going to create this right in the middle. Camera middle X, camera middle Y, and then we have to give it that sequence that we have. So SQ, description, animation. Now, an important thing to note about sequences is that when you make it, this right here I guess it doesn't get larger as you zoom in. This is the origin of the sequence. So if we move this, the sequence itself is going to play exactly the same, but in our level, now this is where this is the actual X and Y of where the sequence comes in. So I'm going to Control Z that. So if we put this right here in the middle, then it's going to behave properly, and we'll know exactly how it works. If we start putting things over here, it's going to get kind of wonky. So just remember that this right here is the origin of your sequence. So in our room, we're going to put it right here in the middle, and so it should appear on the right-hand side, just like we've set up there. And so now let's go ahead and test this out. We should be able to click on an item and have it show up. Awesome. If you're following along in the downloaded project, you shouldn't have an issue, but I did notice that I have two layers, which we haven't used menu items at all, but for some reason my objects were actually inside of menu items, and that was causing a semi-glitch. So just remember that, and I also forgot to add a draw self at the top here. So let's just do that real fast. Okay. Now we've got that. I think a sequence looks slightly too, like it's down just a little bit too much, but that's okay because we can easily change that. So if I wanted to alter the properties, I can change the animation curve, or I can just come in here and I can move it up. If I've got automatic tracking on, then it's going to move for me. And I can open up that curve and see again right there. So now it looks like that. So if I press play, I still think that looks really nice. And there we go. And if we wanted to make it a little bit smaller at the end so that it's not as large, or maybe it's like a smaller version of it, you can also just come in here and drag these down and it will make it smaller overall. So if we do that, let's try it again. There we go. So now it's closer to the middle of that. It's a little bit smaller. And I'm going to move it down just a smidgen again. Okay, that's our sequence. That's putting it in, and that's being able to actually animate it and get it inside of there, no problem. Now, the other thing we have to make sure of is when we're actually done animating, we want to then start showing information. And right now we have what we need to do it, but we haven't done it yet. And I think that qualifies as part of this video, so let's go ahead and do that. We have our sequence instance variable here. So now we're going to go into our step event. And we're going to check the animations here. So I'm going to say if sequence doesn't equal undefined. That's the first thing you got to check, because if it is undefined and you try to access anything about it, then it will crash your game. So if it's not undefined and layer sequence is finished, we just pass in sequence one more time. So we can check to see if it's finished immediately. And then if it is, then we're going to say showing description is equal to true. So now we'll set that equal to true, and we'll just do a quick show message here as well. We'll just say hi, so we can check to see when it is finished, and voila. And it's just always going to be finished now, so there we go. Okay, so now we know when it's done, but how do we get rid of it, and how do we replay this sequence in reverse order? Because we could make a new one and then start that, but there's also another way of doing it, which I think is actually a lot easier and works a lot better, especially if you want it to reverse animate out the same way that you brought it in. So let's go in, and down here, we're going to check to see if we click on the little X of our, can't press spacebar there. If we click on this little X, we want to reverse the animation. Now this is going to be a little tricky because we're going to use the point in rectangle, and although I have a project I'm following from, I probably didn't get the exact X and Y coordinates here, so I got to play around with this a little bit. But I'll also show you kind of how I figure out how to do that, and then you will know how to change this up as well really easily. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a rectangle and see if it is right around where the X is at. So I have some properties here, which are going to be camera X plus 590, camera Y plus 30, camera X plus 620, and camera Y plus 90, and false. And the only reason I'm not using camera middle X and Y is because I didn't do that originally, and trying to convert it in my head would take a while. So that is fairly close. I'm gonna bring in the X, let's say about 580, camera Y 35 to 70. And if we do that, that should be pretty close to the X. If anyone clicks up there, I think they're clearly trying to close it, and that will work fine. So I'm gonna copy these coordinates that we just did, right there. Now, we're gonna say if point in rectangle, paste in those coordinates, but then we also have to put in the X and Y. So we're gonna say mouse X, mouse Y. So if we are doing that, if the point in rectangle is equal to true, and if mouse check button pressed MB left, then this means they want to close it. And now what we actually want to do is reverse our animation, our sequence. So layer, sequence, head direction. So this is where this is how it plays. Normally it plays left to right. And there are different play modes here as well. So you can change the playback mode to repeat or to ping pong to go back and forth. But if we did that, then we'd have to manually check to see when we're at frame 40 and stop it. So I don't want to do that. Instead, I want it to stop on its own. And then when we want to close it, we're just going to say, hey, play this sequence again. And even though you are finished, we're going to change the direction from left to right to left. And that means that now it was at the end, and now it's going to be at the beginning of it. And then we're going to just say layer, sequence, play that sequence. And we are no longer showing our description. So we set this equal to false. And that's actually all we have to do. We have to do one more thing to make sure we can play it again. But now if we come up here and close it, it replays it. If we click again, it's finished because it's playing from right to left. And so it's at the end of that play style. And so let's come into our step event. And we need to make two changes here. But we also need to add in a check to say if we are the direction of left to right, because otherwise this variable is not going to be showing up the way it should. So and all of this, layer, sequence, get, head direction. So now we want to know which way it was. For this sequence is equal to the normal one. So if that's true, then we just finished animating in. Otherwise, I'm going to just copy this whole thing and just change this to left. Because if that happened, then we just finished animating out. And we want to say layer, sequence, destroy. So we're just going to get rid of it. We could just go ahead and reverse it back to the other one, but if we destroy it, then next time we create it, it will come in properly. So now, when we run this, we'll be able to animate in and animate out. And there we go. So this is a long video, but that's because I'm also showing you how to use sequences. Once you understand the power of sequences, which hopefully you do now, you can easily create one in just a minute, throw it in your game, and have complex, beautiful, and awesome animations right then, right there. So that's really cool. Now we have this up and running. This is kind of the part of the flashy, beautiful inventory that we're working on. I think it looks really awesome. I hope you do too. And I hope that you really play around with the sequences and get a feel for what you can do with them and how they work. These are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the functions that you can use in sequences. So continue to check that out, play around with it, and have a great time. But that's all I wanted to do in this video. On every GameMaker tutorial and video I put out from here into the future, I'm going to be giving away one copy of my beginner game developer course. A great way to go from no programming experience to be able to make your own games. To be entered to win, just like the video and leave a comment showing me your keyboard works. You can leave a comment about anything. A week after the video is posted, I will send you a message with the coupon. If you want, you can use it for yourself, give it to a friend, or apply it towards a more expensive course by just sending me an email and letting me know that's what you'd like to do. do. If you want to see more content from me, then subscribe and ring the bell to be notified every time I put out a new video. But that's all I've got for you. So thank you so much for joining me, and as I always say, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later. A huge thank you to all of the awesome people who support me over on Patreon. Their names are on the screen now, and every dollar pledged helps me create more awesome content. You can support me for as little as $1 a month and get access to exclusive perks like my Discord server, your name in the credits, early access to my YouTube videos and courses, and more. Check it out at patreon.com/letslearnthistogether.com or find the link in the description below and become a patron today.